And now on Treasure, we're going to take you to the Thousand Islands in the St. Lawrence River, an area that's had a romantic history of treasure. One of these stories concerns thousands of dollars in gold that went to the bottom of the river just a short distance from the shores of this very island. It's still there, waiting to be found.
I'm Bill Burrid. The program is Treasure. Tonight our story takes place in the Thousand Islands in the St. Lawrence River between Canada and New York State. Our story concerns an incident that occurred in the late 1750s. It seems that there was an illustrious marquis in command of the fort on Ile Royale. And during a raging battle with the British, this marquis decided that it would be better to bury all the gold that belonged to the French forces rather than let it fall into the hands of the enemy. And so, treasure was buried on this same small island in the St. Lawrence River. But the story we're going to tell you about this treasure and how it was discovered doesn't begin until 100 years later.
The time is 1860. The place, a small room in a boarding house in the town of Ogdensburg, New York. Name, Captain Jonathan King. Occupation, riverboat captain on the St. Lawrence. Object, a good night's sleep after a long day spent on the river. Captain King welcomed the quiet of the old house. He was a man who liked to relax after a hard day's work. But there was a man waiting for him. In the silence, King suddenly felt uneasy. He sensed there was someone else in the room. Who could it be at this time of night? How did he get in? He saw the intruder, a thin, nervous-looking man with a little mustache. "Who the devil are you?" King asked. The man began to talk. He said his name was Pierre Pouchet, that he needed King's help. He said that he'd come all the way from France on a very important matter. King told him to get out. But instead of leaving, the Frenchman took a piece of old parchment out of his coat pocket and told King he'd received the parchment from his grandfather, a French marquis who had buried gold on a small island in the St. Lawrence River over 100 years before. "The key to the treasure is the poem you have right there," Pouchet said. King glanced at the parchment and began to read the poem. "You'll find my gold on Ile Royale, and when you find it quite alone, you will discover it in a chest of black, buried within a fist of stone." And then Pouchet offered him half of the gold if he'd take him to Ile Royale. 2 days later, the two men were on their way to the island that lay in the river, 3 miles southwest of Ogdensburg, the town where King had been living. Of course, Captain King knew very little about Pouchet, but, well, the parchment looked like the real thing. The Frenchman must have a lot of faith in it, or else he wouldn't have come so far to look for the gold. Anyway, Pouchet had promised him half the gold if they found it. He claimed that his grandfather had buried the equivalent of some $25,000 in American money. As they began their exploration of the island, King thought about the story that Pouchet had told him. He said that his grandfather at one time commanded the French fort on this very same island. During a battle with the British, he buried all the gold in the fort rather than let the enemy take possession of it. It was this same gold that they were looking for now. $25,000 in gold. King thought about that poem on a piece of parchment. "You will discover it in a chest of black, buried within a fist of stone. As they walked on, King began to see more clearly why Pouchet needed him for this search. Of course, the Frenchman needed someone who could handle a boat. But there was more to it than that. Pouchet looked out of place here on this deserted island. He belonged in a world of warm drawing rooms, gentlemen's taverns, not on a lonely island in the middle of the St. Lawrence River. Pouchet, strange, nervous little man. His delight at being on the island where his grandfather had left him a fortune. He was almost childlike. But Captain King had other things to do. They'd need a place to camp. Pouchet's daydreaming wouldn't get the wood chopped for a fire or the bedrolls ready for the night. King discovered a good spot for the camp and wondered why Pouchet didn't come and help him. But the Frenchman's thoughts were on everything but the practical side of their search. Pouchet kept thinking as he walked through the woods. The gold, when we find it, it'll be mine, all mine. And that stupid man, King, does he really believe I'm going to give him half the gold? Now, this is the Parliament Building in Ottawa, Canada. And in order to document our story, we contacted one of our treasure correspondents in Ottawa, Ruth Barnett. We asked her to find out everything she could about this tale of gold on Ile Royale. We wanted to know what happened to those two men who were so unlike each other in their search for a fortune in buried gold. Ruth Barnett started her job of tracking down this yarn by doing some research in the records that are kept here in this Parliament building. Ottawa itself is built on the banks of the Ottawa River, which flows into the vast St. Lawrence. And it's a city rich in colorful history. It was here that Canada's national capital was established many years ago. It's a city of canals and parks, and, well, its history is inseparable from the history of this river. Ruth Barnett found a few people who knew the story of buried gold on Ile Royale. And at the Parliament building, the librarian told her she ought to take a trip down the St. Lawrence River in order to really understand the background of this treasure tale. So Ruth went to Brockville, Ontario, where she boarded a comfortable motor launch for a complete tour of the Thousand Islands. She asked one of the men on the boat about the story of King and Pouchet. And he said he'd heard of it, added that no one's ever found the gold that was discovered by the two men, but he said, we'll take you right past Chimney Island where it all happened. And he pointed out the beautiful Singer estate built by the man who developed the Singer sewing machine. And then Ruth asked him more about the story of King and Pouchet. Wasn't it called Ile Royale, she asked? Yes, that's what they used to call it, he said. But now it's called Chimney Island. You'll see it pretty soon. The Thousand Islands are covered by beautiful estates like this one, a great change from the days when there was no bridge, when this was the hunting ground for the Indian tribe like the Algonquin or the Iroquois and the Huron. The Indians call the islands Manitona, the Garden of the Great Spirit. And as Ruth Barnett continued her trip down the St. Lawrence, thinking about the gold of Ile Royale, she could understand why so many people would be drawn to these beautiful islands, whether in search of treasure or just refuge from a busy world. And then the pilot of the boat said, there it is, Chimney Island. That's where they looked for the gold, King and that Frenchman. "But why is it so bare? I thought it had trees all over it," said Ruth. The pilot of the launch said the trees had all been burned in a fire. Lightning, for some strange reason, selected this island to strike, leaving very little behind except a number of chimneys. Then he advised her to rent a boat to go to Chimney Island, where the dramatic end of this story occurred. And so she did just that. She headed for the very same island where Pouchet and King had come in search of buried gold. After beaching her boat, Ruth found herself on a lonely, deserted little island that is seldom visited by vacationers because of its bleak appearance. As she walked over the island, she thought back to the story of the riverboat captain and the Frenchman. Perhaps they'd walked over this very spot in their search for treasure. Here she found the last chimney that stands as a reminder of the old fort. The same fort commanded at one time by the French Marquis de Levis, the grandfather of Pouchet. As she looked at the island, Ruth remembered what she'd learned in the Library of Parliament and what the pilot of the launch had told her about the last violent hours of the two men who had come here in 1860, following the riddle of a poem scrawled on a piece of parchment. This is the story that was told to our treasure correspondent. According to the story, King and Pouchet were on the island several days without finding any trace of treasure. And then one day, while King was chopping firewood, Pouchet made a discovery that was a complete surprise to him. Hearing the excited yelling, King became concerned, took his rifle to find out what it was all about. He found the Frenchman standing by a tree, looking confused and angry. King couldn't understand what had started the yelling until Pouchet pointed out to him. It was a hole in the ground. Pouchet was convinced that someone had just been there, escaped with the treasure. King tried to convince him the hole had been dug a long time ago. The earth around the hole was not freshly dug. Besides, there hadn't been any other people on the island, no sign of them. The Frenchman wouldn't listen. He was sure he'd been cheated of his prize. The frustration was too much for his weak mind. He was like an angry child, beating on the earth in frustration. As he left, King wondered about his strange companion. How long before he'd crack completely, and if he did, who would get hurt? Later that afternoon, after Pouchet had calmed down with the help of some wine, he seemed almost docile. He was strangely quiet and subdued. But Captain King was busy with a poem. It kept going through his mind. You will find my gold on Ile Royale, and when you find it quite alone, you will discover it in a chest of black, buried within a fist of stone. King picked up his rifle, starting out again. He was going to look once more before giving up the search. The reference to a fist of stone was such a definite clue. If he could just discover what it meant, he might find the gold. Pouchet was still skeptical, but he wasn't going to take any chances. Taking a last swallow of wine to bolster his spirits, he followed the captain, hoping they might find some inkling to the mystery of that poem. the afternoon wore on, Pouchet was getting tired and discouraged. Perhaps he thought this whole thing is just a monstrous joke played on me by my grandfather. King, too, was getting tired, but he kept going. There had to be some answer somewhere on this island. And then he saw something he could hardly believe. A huge rock, the same rock he'd stopped beside. A fist of stone. His heart was pounding. He'd found it. The gold, the gold. Pouchet! Pouchet! The Frenchman didn't understand all the excitement. King said, "There's your fist." Pouchet, like a child in a trance, realized what had happened. King had found the fist of stone. This was it, the answer to the riddle. Now they'd get the treasure inside if someone else hadn't beaten them to it. Once on top of the fist, King looked down and found a natural opening in the big rock, large enough for a man's body to be lowered into it by a strong rope. As they worked preparing the rope, Pouchet's mind was racing now. The gold seemed so near and yet so far. If it's there, he thought, I'll find a way to keep it all myself. King doesn't deserve any of it. After all, my grandfather left it to me, all of it. Covered by earth, the black chest of gold, almost too good to be true, and King's hands now were trembling as he held a heavy box. Now he'd have money, more than he ever dreamed of as a riverboat skipper. King thought, we can leave here. But Pouchet, he had different plans for Captain King. The gold would be just enough for him. Captain King would have a nice long wait at the bottom of that hole. Pouchet! Pouchet! Just to be on the safe side, Pouchet picked up King's rifle and started running for the beach, the gold under his arm. Pouchet! Pouchet! Pouchet was well on his way to freedom with the treasure. But there was still one final bit of irony that had to play itself out in this struggle for gold. Then Pouchet made his great mistake. He fumbled with the rifle, trying to get in a position to shoot King. Instead, he blasted a hole in the bottom of the canoe. The cold river water began to pour in the opening. The canoe started to sink. Captain King was forced to return to shore by the freezing water, exhausted, beaten. And in the boat, the terrified Frenchman tried to think up some way to save himself and his precious gold. He even tied the chest to his own body as though by some miracle the gold would save his life. The game was over. Pouchet, who'd been so anxious for his fortune, took it with him to the bottom of the St. Lawrence River.
And so, for the second time, the gold of the Marquis disappeared. And presumably, it's still at the bottom of the St. Lawrence River, near what's now called Chimney Island. When we were there making this film, we asked several people about any efforts that have been made to retrieve this valuable treasure. We talked to an expert skin diver, but he told us that the water of the river is much too murky to see in when you're swimming on the bottom. Then we asked a deep sea diver who has spent his life doing salvage work about finding the gold. But he said the shifting tides, the silt on the bottom of the St. Lawrence would make it almost impossible to locate a treasure that had been under the water for 200 years. And so, the Frenchman who said, "If the gold goes over, I go with it," had the last word after all. His gold is still hidden somewhere at the bottom of the St. Lawrence River. Until we meet once again, this is Bill Burrid saying goodbye and good hunting.